Seems hard to believe that judges want to try and stop us from looking for corruption, especially when we found hundreds of millions of dollars worth, much more than that, in just a short period of time. And we want to weed out the corruption. And it seems hard to believe that a judge could say, we don't want you to do that. Well, so maybe we have to look at the judges, because that's a very serious, I think it's a very serious violation. I'll ask Elon Musk to say a few words, and we'll take some questions. Elon, go ahead.
Sure. So at a high level, if you say what is the goal of Doge, and I think a significant part of the presidency is to restore democracy. This may seem like, well, aren't we in a democracy? Well, if you don't have a feedback loop, okay, we would have to, if you sorry. So, I tell you, gravitas can be difficult sometimes. If there's not a good feedback loop from the people to the government, and if you have rule of the bureaucrat, if the bureaucracy is in charge, and then what meaning does democracy actually have? If the people cannot vote and have their will be decided by their elected representatives in the form of the president and the Senate and the House, then we don't live in a democracy, we live in a bureaucracy. So it's incredibly important that we close that feedback loop, we fix that feedback loop, and that the public's elected representatives, the President, the House, and the Senate, decide what happens, as opposed to a large, unelected bureaucracy. This is not to say that there are good people who are in the federal bureaucracy, but you can't have an autonomous federal bureaucracy. You have to have one that is responsive to the people. That's the whole point of a democracy. And if you looked at this, if you looked at the founders today and said, what do you think of the way things have turned out? Well, we have this unelected, fourth unconstitutional branch of government, which is the bureaucracy, which has, in a lot of ways, currently more power than any elected representative. And this is not something that people want, and it does not match the will of the people. So it's just something we've got to fix. And then we've also got to address the deficit. So we've got a $2 trillion deficit, and if we don't do something about this deficit, the country's going bankrupt. I mean, it's really astounding that the interest payments alone on the national debt exceed the Defense Department budget, which is shocking, because we spend a lot of money on defense. But if that just keeps going, we're essentially going to bankrupt the country. So what I really want to say is, like, it's not optional for us to reduce the federal expenses. It's essential. It's essential for America to remain solvent as a country.
We're going to interrupt this pablum to fact check it a little bit. One, irony died while he was talking. The only unelected party in any of this is Elon Musk. Andrew Nassios, who was the administrator of USAID, a lifelong Republican and self-described hardline conservative, said it took 1 month to turn the mission of USAID in the direction of a hard-right conservative agenda from the Clinton years. So the idea that the bureaucracy, as Elon Musk is describing, isn't responsive to the policymaker is destroyed by the fact pattern as testified to by Democratic and Republican cabinet officials. But there you have it. The co-president speaking much longer and in far greater detail than the president, drawing into serious question, who's in charge?
Well, let's say it ain't we the people, because I think what they've just forgotten, that long litany of misinformation and disinformation, which is just my real nice way of saying lies. There was a whole bunch of lying in there, starting with Donald Trump acting like a judge in the Doge case was not protecting the rights of ordinary people, which is what that case was about, right? It was actually about our rights. Every last one of us that has Social Security numbers in that data, when Elon Musk had his employees go in and seize data, that's our data. So this whole thing and this question about elections, you already pointed out the big irony, but the other point of this is it's actually the courts are actually created through the Constitution. So it is an estate in the separation of powers, and it is there to protect us against the kind of overreach and lawlessness we have been watching unfold for the past 3 weeks. And for Elon Musk to call for the impeachment, which he has, of this judge who was following the law, is really to say, unless you do our bidding, we will suggest we should come for your job, even though you are supposed to be independent from us, and that is the balance of power. And I just, there's one other point, which is so critical, is for them to actually be saying this now, when guess what the will of the people wasn't? The will of the people was not the Supreme Court's overturning Roe v. Wade and saying we couldn't have rights to decide when and how we start a family. That was not the will of the people, but yet I didn't see or hear any of this about the judiciary when we got that ruling from the Supreme Court.
Let me just ask, is he still talking?
Then when you understand that, then it makes sense.
Is Donald Trump, he's still talking, I'm told. Is Donald Trump still just listening to Elon Musk talk? Donald Trump is still, right now, listening to Elon Musk talk. So, Glenn Thrush, as a longtime watcher of Donald Trump and of politics in general, have you ever seen Donald Trump watch someone talk instead of him at an event for this long?
The look you're seeing right there is the Trump looking at the kid mowing the lawn look, Nicole. Look right there.
Yeah.
I mean, here's what people don't really get is like the one group of people that Trump has typically over the course of his career been fairly deferential to are bankers. He has an enormous amount of respect for people who have accumulated a lot of money. He understands money power. And so the one person that he is less likely to sort of challenge, and this is why when people are like, when is he going to get tired of him? I think it's going to be a lot longer than people expect because Trump knows how much money that this man has. The other thing that's just kind of remarkable about this, apart from this being sort of like this 45-second civics lesson, is we do have a feedback loop. It's called Article 1 of the Constitution, and it created the Congress. Congress has the power of the purse, raises taxes, makes fiscal decisions, creates budget bills. We're seeing that awful, terrible process playing out right now in the House, and it will ultimately get resolved. And various players have leverage. That is the way this democracy is put together. Now, the alternate model here, and I think what people are failing to sort of understand necessarily, this is not about efficiency and corruption. Doge and Musk's folks are coders. This isn't the General Accounting Office. They're not doing a rational assessment of where the money ought to be spent. And as we know, budgets are moral documents. These are decisions made by representatives about how the government's going to spend its money. No, this is about shrinking radically domestic spending, because we notice Doge hasn't really gone fulsomely after military spending, but this is about domestic or discretionary international spending on programs that Democrats and liberals have established over the years. So this is about destruction of an entire idea of government, about the communality of public spending and government being a tool to address inequities, both racially, economically, and societally. Now, elections do have consequences, but we have never seen anything like this. An individual who is coming from the private space, who presumably wants to take some of these functions and privatize them, perhaps for his own to his own ultimate economic advantage.
I mean, Glenn, two things come to mind. I mean, one, you've now got the Republicans and the MAGA movement in the position of defending the acronyms. I mean, every Republican has to defend Doge. What's Doge? Why do I care about Doge? Why does Doge have all the power? But two, what you just said, they didn't go in with forensic accountants, which would have been I mean, there's some of Musk's rhetoric that I imagine does resonate beyond the right, and that is creating efficiencies inside the bureaucracy. But what people don't understand about the bureaucracy is they hunger for that. They hunger for direction. Every 4 years, especially when the White House changes parties, they await their new blueprint. That's not what Elon Musk is doing. He didn't go in with a single forensic accountant that I've seen reported in your publication or ours. He went in with coders, with really controversial online footprints, without any budgetary experience, without any accounting experience. and they pursued everyone's personal information. Do we know, or was anyone able to ascertain why?
Again, we're in terra incognita. We don't even know who a lot of these people are. We don't know how many of these folks are embedded into the government. I will tell you, having covered the transition, there was a much different idea of how DOJ was going to function. The sense was that it was going to create sort of this second bureaucracy that was going to be watching, almost like an additional IG embedded. No one expected them to sort of head towards the nexus of power. And you have to hand it to Musk. Musk understands power. He knows where the wall socket is and how to pull out a plug. That he is completely aware of in a way that I think a lot of the people who oppose him aren't. He sees this entire system in this country from a power perspective. Trump does as well, but Musk has a real genius for figuring out how to turn off the surge protector for the U.S. government. But it does not necessarily have to do with an assessment of any given program, because if you look, I've read tons of GAO reports and sat through a lot of boring congressional hearings, and really where you really catch the savings, apart from kind of the healthcare sector, and there's not a huge will at the moment congressionally to examine that in a really rapacious way, is defense spending. And he hasn't gone near that. If you were serious about really cutting waste, fraud, and abuse, you should start with the Pentagon. But he hasn't.
And listen, entitlements and defense are the big drivers of the size of the budget. And instead, their stated intent is to traumatize the workforce of agencies like USAID, which the only thing I would differ with Glenn on is Republicans have enthusiastically boosted the budgets of USAID as well. I think the application of USAID programs to help fight terrorism all exploded under George W. Bush.
And you know what's interesting, Lisa, is that the charges haven't been officially dropped. The DOJ is ordering the office, the SDNY, to drop these charges, but so far they still stand.
So far, we've seen no entry on the docket, Katie, that would indicate that the office is dropping it. And the other thing that they've done here that I find sort of strange is that the memo through which they have ordered SDNY to drop these charges was made public. Usually those are conversations that take place privately between Main Justice and components of the department. Here, they wanted everyone to know exactly what it was that they had ordered and why they ordered it. They wanted that predicate for the weaponization of federal government to be sort of embedded in people's consciousness about why they were purportedly ordering Danielle Sassoon, who's the acting U.S. attorney, to drop the case. But they underestimate the Southern District to some extent, or I hope that they are underestimating Danielle Sassoon. This is an office that has rigorous protocols, as all DOJ offices do, in terms of their charging decisions, papering why it is that a case is going to be charged, what the evidence is. And all of that exists here. It's not like some people stood in a back room, drummed their fingers together and said, let's charge Eric Adams because he doesn't like President Biden's immigration policies. That's not how it works. And I would expect Danielle Sassoon to have the backs of her line prosecutors and those supervisors in the same way that Trump acting U.S. Attorney Jeff Berman did during the first Trump administration.
Maybe she's going to say, fire me, I'm not going to do this, have somebody else carry it out. Katie, again, this is layered. It's not just the Trump administration saying, we feel like this guy's been unfairly targeted. We want to criticize the Biden team. This is the way we're going to do it. They're not dismissing the charges and saying we're never going to file them again. They put in a memo that, yes, these charges haven't been looked into fully, but we think that they're distracting Mayor Adams from helping us with immigration enforcement that feels like a sword of Damocles that is hanging over his neck.
Exactly. And like you said, they didn't say the charges are incorrect or false. They're just saying they're impeding with the mayor acting to order out President Trump's mass deportation rules and what he wants to do, mass deportation in the nation's largest city, a sanctuary city that the mayor has taken care of 180,000 migrants over the last 2.5 years, which he's been very critical of. And he says that is why he has been charged, because he was critical of Biden's administration and what the city had to do. What you also see is what he will actually have to continue to do while he is still mayor. He has a primary in June and a general election in November. And as the memo states, if he does not, it's likely looking at if he does not win his election, as soon as he's no longer mayor of New York City, Trump and his team can say, we actually don't need you anymore.
So what's the expectation among City Hall reporters about how Mayor Adams is going to start acting now that this is potentially about to get dropped?
Well, we actually had a preview of it yesterday. Hours before this memo dropped, I reported that the mayor gathered his top commissioners, the police commissioner, the head of health and hospitals executive, the schools chancellor, and said, you don't like Donald Trump? Don't say anything about it. Do not criticize the federal government. Do not criticize this administration. We have billions of dollars in federal grants, and I will take care of it. And a lot of people were really disturbed by this meeting because there was a lot of confusion over what to do if ICE comes to city buildings. No one knew what to do. There was differing messages being sent to city employees. And of course, this was met with a lot of criticism and really anger yesterday. This was, of course, before the memo dropped, because people are thinking he is just rolling over and telling Trump, do whatever you want in New York City, I don't care. Reverend Sharpton said today that this is very disturbing, and he said, quote, that he believes the mayor is like the hostage of President Trump. So I think we'll see more of that.
So, I mean, I know my kids go to public school here in the city, and there was a memo that went out just laying out the policies the school has if ICE shows up in front of the school. Do those policies still stand? I mean, can we ask the question of whether Mayor Adams is going to enforce that at schools or at other sensitive places? I know the Trump team said those places are fine, that we're going to go to those places. But the cities can stand in the way of that. So what's the expectation of what Mayor Adams will be doing?
Schools actually have a slightly more extreme protection from ICE, given that there's children inside. But I think the concern was what we saw under the previous mayor, under the first Trump term, was a mayor who was really strongly against President Trump and his policies. We don't have that this time. So people were very fearful that if ICE shows up, not just at the school, but, you know, they're afraid of when I'm taking my kid to school, if I'm on the bus or the subway, will ICE bombard me there? There was a concern about attendance numbers in January post-inauguration, if there was an actual dip. The school's chancellor initially said that one of the factors was fear from immigrant students. The mayor's office was very mad that she said that, and then she walked it back. So I think that's, people are afraid of, it seems like, a lack of independence.
All right, Andrew, let's go to the bigger picture here. I laid out all of the other things that are going on. You have Mayor Adams and then the case probably getting dropped, or at least DOJ wanting it to be dropped in exchange, it appears, for immigration enforcement. You have the pardoning, the full pardon now of the governor of Illinois, former governor of Illinois, Blagojevich. You also have the, Don't Enforce Foreign Bribery Act. You had the gutting of FARA, or the non-enforcement of FARA, the leniency on it, which is the Foreign Registration Act. Take all these things together and then tell me what the Justice Department is going to be interested in doing.
So I think that is exactly the right way to look at this, which is you have to look at this together and not individually. And as a friend of mine said, who is a white-collar defense lawyer, this is a great time to be a sort of corporate criminal. Because Pam Bondi, the new attorney general, announced in her first day in a series of memos the gutting of various laws and protections. They dismantled the National Security Division's corporate task force. I used to oversee the Foreign Corrupt Protection Act that was in there to stop bribery. Every single country in the world prohibits bribery. And we have been prosecuting the FCPA violations. Now it is law of the jungle, where every corporation is now free to, according to Pam Bondi, bribe companies and bribe public officials in order to gain business. Who does that? I mean, this is supposed to be a rule of law country. Republican and Democratic administrations had been fighting that. It is now a great time to be a foreign adversary because, as you pointed out, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, the Kleptocracy Initiative, all of that has been disbanded. So if you want to engage in foreign interference with our elections, you're free to do that. It is really sort of a remarkable set of changes. And it's useful to, I think, to think about this not in terms of all of the lawsuits we've seen, which is attacking actions by the Trump administration, which are alleged to be illegal. These are actions that are just policy differences, but are sort of horrendous if you believe in the rule of law. And it's really making the American country sort of unsafe because it's like saying corrupt American actors get to go forward in terms of white-collar crime and political adversaries get to engage in corruption here. And it looks like Pam Bondi's attorney general is going to look the other way.
Yeah, there's also the FARA stuff. I mean, we just saw Senator Menendez get put in prison, sentenced to prison for taking money from the government of Egypt. I mean, that was a big deal. It's a Democrat falling afoul of that law. What does it say about what our lawmakers are going to be allowed to do now by not investigating FARA violations, as the DOJ is saying it's, and tell me if I'm getting it wrong, the DOJ is basically saying we're not going to investigate as heavily FARA as we did in the past.
Yeah, what Pam Bondi said in her memo is that if you are a foreigner, whether it's a foreign country or a foreign person, and you are spending millions of dollars to lobby here and to influence American policy, we are not going to investigate that criminally. And so the hammer that sort of helps prevent our foreign adversaries from doing that surreptitiously is gone. So that means that Russia, to take an example, China, other adversaries who spend millions and millions of dollars to lobby congressional leaders, to influence our policies, do not have to disclose that they're doing that. And Pam Bondi herself was a registrant and had to disclose under the FARA statute. What I do find interesting, Katie, is Senator Grassley, a very sort of well-known Republican leader, is a big proponent of the FARA statute. He, for years, to his credit, had been chastising the Department of Justice, saying there needs to be more criminal enforcement of the FARA statute because he saw the problem. And he said, you're not sufficiently deterring what I am seeing going on. And the department in the last, basically since the Mueller investigation, has done a lot with respect to enforcement of the FARA statute. And Pam Bondi on day one said, no more criminal prosecutions under FARA.
There's that. There's also, Ken, let's talk about whistleblowers. The whistleblower protections are being paused right now or gutted. And give me the actual reporting on that. And then there's the IGs that all got dismissed. It feels like anybody who might want to raise their hand and say this isn't okay, this is corruption, is not that, getting that message is not welcome, it appears, within the Trump administration.
Yeah, I think you're talking about the Office of Special Counsel, which is the entity that looks after whistleblowers and inside the federal government, not to be confused with Special Counsel Jack Smith, that kind of special counsel. The Trump administration fired the head of that office, and he's now litigating to try to get his job back. But yeah, you're absolutely right. The firing of the IGs, that was a one-day story almost. We've almost moved past it. My particular fascination and thing that we should not forget is the firing of prosecutors who worked for Jack Smith. And what most people think was an illegal firing because they're civil servants. They have a right to due process, and they were not given that. They were escorted out, essentially. So that sent the message on day one that we are going to get rid of prosecutors, and later we learned FBI agents, who worked on cases that we don't like, regardless of whether we have cause to fire them. That is a chilling message. That is not how the United States has run, particularly since Watergate. And now with the Eric Adams decision, the Justice Department is sending the message that the post-Watergate norms that separate politics from decisions about criminal investigations, those are essentially out the window. And, look, Donald Trump and many people around him promised that was coming, but it's another thing to see it actually happening in the first month of the administration in such a dramatic fashion, Katie.
A federal judge in Rhode Island said the Trump administration has violated his order to lift a sweeping freeze on federal spending and has ordered the government to restore the funds immediately. This is the first time in Trump's second term that a judge has accused the Trump administration to be disobeying a judicial mandate. The ruling comes in response to a lawsuit brought by 22 attorneys general in Democratic-led states after a wide-ranging OMB directive caused chaos and confusion across the country. The Trump administration said they will appeal the decision. Yesterday, the president took a swipe at the judicial branch, saying that there have been some very bad rulings and that it's a shame to see it. This comes amid overall concerns the Trump administration will not comply with court orders from judges who have ruled against the president's agenda. That's because of a social media post on Sunday from the vice president, J.D. Vance, who wrote in part, judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power. Yesterday, Republican Senator Tommy Tuberville was asked whether the White House has a right to circumvent judges who are halting executive actions. The Trump ally said, quote, I think they do. But here's how other Republican senators responded to that question.
Well, I mean, the courts obviously are the sort of the branch of our government that calls balls and strikes and referees, and I think that they've got an important role to play. So I expect that to continue, and I expect the court to play the important role of ensuring that, that the laws in the country are followed.
When you have a lawsuit, somebody wins and somebody loses. But I support the process, and I support the legitimacy of the federal judiciary. If you disagree, and many people, I've disagreed with opinions before, that's why God made courts of appeal, and that's why God made the U.S. Supreme Court. But you're never going to hear me attack the legitimacy of the federal judiciary.
Well, I don't even think we have seen that yet, so it's a hypothetical.
J.D. Vance didn't say anything about anything that was not appropriate. He's saying on the appropriate use of executive powers. I think that's what he meant. I think it's a very, very clear line between the powers that are there that are appropriate. This president is saying, I believe I have the authority. You find out in a court of law, and if they are appropriate, you move forward with them.
And should follow whatever the court's decision ultimately is?
Well, we have to. We will follow the decisions of the court, and I don't think there's been anybody saying no.
Of course, and Willie, it's one of the things I said yesterday. It's like though it was meant to troll, and though J.D. Vance has said, and we heard it a couple of years ago on that podcast, that he thought you should just run over the third branch, like Andrew Jackson. The United States senators, I would say, other than maybe Tommy Tuberville and maybe a handful of others, overwhelming majority of senators are going to say what an overwhelming majority of members of Congress are going to say, which is you have to follow the court's decisions. And the fact that anybody would even suggest that you don't is, it's okay for us to say that's shocking that they missed, I guess, civics class starting in 4th or 5th grade, or maybe they didn't have it. Maybe that's the problem. But as Senator Rounds said, it is the courts we listen to, and they define what is legitimate. They define what is not legitimate. Sometimes the president likes it. Sometimes the president doesn't. And yesterday, we went through 4 years of federal rulings where the federal courts enjoined, stopped, or overturned what President Joe Biden did.
Yeah, and we saw just yesterday, we'll go through some of it, a flurry of court action of stopping some of these policies and these executive orders put in place by the Trump administration. And almost everyone we heard there is a lawyer, Joe, and we've talked about this. J.D. Vance went to Yale Law School. He was on the Yale Law Review. John Kennedy went to prestigious schools. They're all lawyers. They can't say anything other with a straight face, I hope, than we have 3 co-equal branches of government. If you don't like the way a court rules, we've got the Court of Appeals you can go to, and then you can go up to the Supreme Court if you think it ought to go that far. That's just the way the system works, and anything else ought to be noise. We'll see again how they hold up under pressure from Donald Trump. But for now, at least a handful of them there saying the right things. Let's bring in NBC News Justice and Intelligence correspondent Ken Dilanian and MSNBC legal analyst Danny Savalos. Guys, good morning. Danny, start with you. What do you make of that back and forth there? J.D. Vance saying, well, we don't always have to listen to what the courts say, and some other senators pushing back on that idea or trying to interpret for J.D. Vance what they hope he meant by that. What did you hear?
Yeah, historically, this has happened before. I think J.D. Vance even referred to this situation way back. President Andrew Jackson refused to enforce an order by the Supreme Court that resolved a clash between the Cherokee Nation and the state of Georgia. And history's lesson is, well, not a whole lot happens to a president or an administration who refuses to follow an order, because we operate on this kind of trust that the president will do that. And while it's probably apocryphal that Jackson said he has his order, meaning the Supreme Court, let's see them enforce it, it's a scary quote, if true, because it's really an unspoken thing that the courts don't really have their own armies. They don't have a powerful arm to enforce their orders. They rely on the government working properly and not defying them. So it is a scary concept. Presidents may have that power. Maybe it's not so much that they have that power. It's just that no one can stop them from not following the courts.
Allie.
Ken, I do have a question for you, though, because although senators are talking about this as theoretical and hypothetical, even as some of them are saying they're uncomfortable or trying to explain away what the vice president and others have seemingly suggested, you are seeing this federal judge up in Rhode Island saying that the Trump administration is already balking at the court's order, not unfreezing the frozen spending and federal grant money. So push is seemingly already coming to shove here.
That's absolutely right, Allie. Taking us out of the realm of a theoretical discussion into the practical and the real. Here you have this federal judge in Rhode Island saying very explicitly that I believe you're violating my order, that you stop this spending freeze and resume funding to places like the National Institutes of Health, because I think that's unconstitutional. And he began his ruling with a quote from a Supreme Court decision that essentially says those who defy federal court orders risk criminal contempt. Now, he didn't explicitly threaten the Trump administration with criminal contempt in the rest of the ruling, but that was certainly the implication of opening that way. And it raises a whole host of questions, which is, how does a judge hold an administration in criminal contempt? I mean, who do you can't jail the president, obviously. In fact, if we remember, Donald Trump was held in criminal contempt by the New York judge in his criminal case, but that judge was very reluctant to mete out that ultimate sanction of jail time. It didn't happen when he was the ex-president. It's not going to happen when he's the president. So what are the remedies? I mean, we were gaming this out yesterday. Are they going to throw some hapless Justice Department lawyer who happens to be in the courtroom, throw that person in jail? Do they levy fines? What would be the point of fining the federal government, which has unlimited resources? So we're really at that point where it's starting to become a practical question, not just a theoretical question. And the other issue is it's really difficult for the judge to get the facts when you have a government agency and, the plaintiffs aren't allowed inside, and you have Elon Musk and his people and they're saying, well, we are spending the money, and folks are saying, well, we're not getting the money. So it's a really difficult situation, guys.
So it was good to hear some of the Republicans saying you're not going to hear us thwarting the law. But at the same time, Danny, if you look at the front page of the New York Times right now, it says basically we're in a constitutional crisis, even though there isn't a complete clear definition. Citing different deans of law schools from across the country and experts talking about being in this crisis because of the flurry of things that Trump has done, from birthright citizenship, freezing federal spending, shutting down agencies, removing leaders from agencies. The systematic, unconstitutional, and illegal acts create a constitutional crisis, one legal expert said. The distinctive feature of the current situation, several legal scholars said, is its chaotic flood of activity and collectively amounts to a radically new conception of presidential power. It is a constitutional crisis when the President of the United States doesn't care what the Constitution says, regardless whether Congress or the courts resist. Up until now, while presidents might engage in particular acts that were unconstitutional, there was never a sense that, the Constitution was meaningless. And the bottom line is the flurry and the chaos of it may make it so that the courts won't even have the time to react. To that, you say what?
I think we need to be careful with the term constitutional crisis, because as I define it, that would be a situation where the Constitution doesn't have an answer and there is a pressing conflict. The flurry of executive orders, the chaos, that I think doesn't get us to crisis yet. It is irritating for the courts. It is challenging. It could lead to a serious problem if, as you said, they become too congested with dealing with these orders.
They keep coming.
The crisis occurs, and we've already talked about it, at the moment when there is a court order and the president or the administration refuses to follow it. Because historically, we don't really have a clear answer for what to do in that situation. On the first half of it, issuing a bunch of executive orders, not only do we know that the courts can handle it, they already did this back in 2017. This is the same MO. The Trump administration then would just fire out executive orders. It felt like they weren't even spell checking them. And then they would let the courts prune them like the proverbial bonsai tree, or they would just withdraw them and go back to the drawing board. It's probably not the most efficient way of doing it. It's chaotic, as you said. It's problematic.
Yeah.
But constitutional crisis for me is the moment the court issues an order and the administration resists. You could say that the last notable occurrence was when Nixon initially refused to comply with a subpoena issued by the Supreme Court. Eventually, he capitulated. But history is full of these near crises examples. The question is, what do we do going forward?
And the funding freeze is just one case of the courts pushing back. We have a long list in front of us this morning. The buyout pause was extended by a federal judge. The birthright citizenship contesting that was blocked again. Funding of NIH that was cut by the administration, that's been blocked again by a judge. So you're seeing the courts stepping in here. We'll see what happens next.
I want to bring in NBC's Ken Dilanian at the Justice Department. Harry Litman is a former U.S. attorney, former Deputy Assistant Attorney General, and host of the Talking Feds podcast. With me here in studio is former Florida Republican Congressman David Jolly, who was also an MSNBC political analyst. Tell us more about this order, Ken.
Well, Chris, as you mentioned, they said it wasn't about the facts and the law, but they did say it was about what they believed was the weaponization of the Justice Department in bringing this case. And, you know, Eric Adams has been complaining that he got crosswise with the Biden administration over immigration, and that's why they charged him. There's no evidence of that. But that sentiment was reflected in this memo. I want to read it to you. It says, it cannot be ignored that Mayor Adams criticized the prior administration's immigration policies before the charges were filed, and the former U.S. attorney's public actions created appearances of impropriety. That's a reference to the Biden-appointed U.S. attorney Damian Williams. DOJ officials believe he used the case to burnish his image. That's debatable. But what's alarming Justice Department officials here is the idea that the political leadership of the DOJ is ordering line prosecutors to drop a high-profile political corruption case for which they unveiled a massive amount of evidence in a speaking indictment. For his part, Eric Adams is continuing to proclaim his innocence, and he's sort of acting as if this is all over. Let's take a listen to Eric Adams.
As I said from the outset, I never broke the law, and I never would. I thank the Justice Department for its honesty. Now, we can put this cruel episode behind us and focus entirely on the future of our city. It's time to move forward.
So a couple of things about that. Number one, the case hasn't been dismissed yet. This is an order to the Southern District of New York. As far as we know, nobody in that office has carried out that order, and it's going to be an interesting question to see whether anyone resigns rather than do that. The second thing, though, is that these charges are being dismissed without prejudice, according to the memo, or will be if that's what happens, meaning that they can be refiled at any time. So the idea that he's completely out of the woods is an open question. And another open question is how much leverage does that give Donald Trump and the Trump administration over the mayor of New York when they are trying to, for example, more strictly enforce immigration laws in what has been a sanctuary city, Chris?
Well, not a bad question, Congressman, right? I mean, what does it mean? We can reinstate these charges against you at any minute.
It's a hostage situation. Look, I think there's a lot going on. I think people are right to feel that it feels a little dirty. It feels a little transactional. It also was very obvious in its politics. Even the memo from DOJ said Eric Adams needs to focus on illegal immigration and fighting violent crime, with kind of a nod to the Biden administration letting it go unchecked. But then there is this question about what type of leverage, because it was dismissed without prejudice, which means the charges could come back. And listen, this is also Donald Trump, who faces, though largely at the state level, faces a lot of his own liability and vulnerability in the city and in the state of New York. He, I believe, his license to practice or be engaged in nonprofits has been revoked. We know the charges that have happened at the state level. He has created an ally. And I think what this also says is not only is the Trump administration's DOJ now transactional, but what are the opportunities for other elected officials facing peril? I mean, SDNY is somebody that's prosecuted a lot of cases recently, political cases, including Republicans and Democrats. What does that mean in terms of the currency that Donald Trump now wields over them?
Harry, I think one of the extraordinary parts of this is that they didn't even try to argue the facts, the law here. What do you see when you read this order?
Extraordinary isn't the word. Singular and unique is the word. The idea that they would be doing this without any attention to the facts and the law is absolute anathema to the Department of Justice. The currency of all cases are facts and law. The idea of not judging weaponization based on facts and law is, again, anathema to the Department of Justice. An alien force has invaded the Department of Justice and is imposing rank political and, as David says, transactional considerations, and that completely corrupt and politicize the DOJ's function. This is really beyond any possible justification in Department of Justice annals dating back to all our lifetimes and before. The Department of Justice acts on facts and law, not on politics, and this is a really ugly day and a big black eye that won't go away soon.
A black eye that won't go away. What's the real world impact as you see it, Harry?
Two, I think first, exactly as David said, open season for politicians to come in and make deals and get off scot-free. It's such an important part of the DOJ mission. And then the harm enacted on all of us. If the allegations are accurate, that's what juries are for, of course. And the SDNY has just said that they had much more evidence, then there are victims to these crimes, and including clean government, corrupt, honest government. If there's open season now, that is off the table and everyone suffers. By the way, to Ken's point, the acting U.S. attorney in Manhattan is a long-standing, very credentialed pro, and we'll see whether she doesn't say, I'm going to resign now. So there could also be an immediate kind of political crisis. I'm sure she's thinking of it seriously. This is an absolute dishonorable order that she's been asked to execute.
And Congressman, there's another memo. The Washington Post reported on this. It says that the president and his top officials are free to discuss ongoing criminal and civil cases with the attorney general and deputies, something past administrations, as you know, have explicitly shied away from. They don't want that appearance of any kind of political interference. Is this a strategy of, we're going to tell you up front what we're doing? I mean, and this is the way it is.
And it can be dressed up by the people around him, this advance of the unitary executive, that there are these powers in the presidency that other presidents haven't used before, but Donald Trump is using for the first time. I think that's all garbage. I am unapologetic in suggesting we are in a constitutional crisis right now. We have seen it in violations of the Impoundment Act. We've seen it in violations of Elon Musk and security information. We're seeing in Donald Trump's use of the Department of Justice, the transactional nature of this. But the constitutional crisis is not simply because of the malfeasance of the president. It's because of the collapse of the Congress. The crisis, we have seen malfeasance before. We have seen abuse by a president before. But a crisis did not occur because it was checked by the courts or checked by the Congress. In this case, you have a Congress that has collapsed, a Republican Congress who has said, we are going to let the president do these things. That has created the crisis. We should not be tepid about using that word. There is a constitutional crisis right now as a result of the malfeasance of Donald Trump, but the lack of accountability being exerted by the U.S. Congress.